Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth week of 422. It's starting to fly by. You all have been rocking it. The assignments have been spot on. I have to admit, I was a little worried about how this would go online, but it seems like you're all doing awesome work. Hopefully, you're learning some stuff and getting out of the class. Again, as I will always say, probably every week, if you are having problems, please stop by and see me or talk to me. I've talked to a few people actually face to face. And plus, I kind of like it to kind of meet everyone and see where everyone's standing. Um, One positive, I believe everyone in this class is now an advisee for me, so we will probably get together. We might even be able to debrief a little bit when we do advising, so that actually makes me feel a little better also. Next week, I don't want to jump the gun. It's a big week in terms of knowing how to do your unit plans. So not this lecture, I'm talking the week after. So you may see some stuff flowing in the fourth week related to unit planning. Don't worry about that. That's more for week 5, but it's our big assignment, and I'm doing it a little different since we're online, and I'm trying to make it a little more inquiry based. So, but with all that being said, I shouldn't have probably even mentioned it, but I'm not going to stop the video. Week 5 is going to be a big one in terms of just how we're going to do unit planning, and I'll probably even set up something where if you need to meet with me or get together or Zoom or whatever, we'll do it. But with all that being said, let's not worry about that. I'm giving it the safe sign, I guess. Let's get it out. This week, we're going to look at teaching strategy. Teaching strategies is actually kind of a fun little discussion because it's the stuff you're not going to do in the class. I will say this a bazillion times also if you have me, but it's just something I do believe in. No matter what you do in class, you got to do with what works for you and what's comfortable. The main thing that I wish I had thought of when I was teaching right off the bat was you got to be yourself somewhat in the classroom. So you got to do activities that you are comfortable with and that you think work for you. You also have to be willing to fail a little bit in terms of things that don't work. And what I mean by that is if something doesn't go the way you like it, it's not saying you can't try it again. You just need to rework it. That's kind of the anything in life. So any of these strategies you could try. Don't worry if they don't work the way you want them to the first time. Believe me, I have a list of this long of teaching disasters that I still add to weekly. So it's just one of those things. It's part of just learning in general. We're going to look at some strategies. We'll also incorporate these after the planning in a couple weeks. We're going to start looking at specific fields and social studies and things that you can do and such. So with all that being said, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint here in a second. I'm going to pull up the syllabus first just to make sure we're on the same page. And we'll kind of go from there. Let me share my screen. And hopefully you can see the syllabus there. The only reason I'm pulling it up, just to make sure you know where we are. We are right here. This is the week that this lecture is pertaining to, teaching strategies. It relates to chapters 5 and 6 in your textbook. First quiz is actually due on Sakai. This week I'll show you where that is at the end, but that's related to chapters 1 through 5 in your textbooks. Couple of things with that. One, you're welcome to use your textbooks. It's mainly to make sure that you're opening it and looking at it. Two, I thought I had caught everything, but when I made these quizzes a long time ago, I've tried to update them. They were based on the old, I think I have mine right here, the old 3rd edition of the book. We are now on the 4th edition, which I have actually on my iPad. I thought I've updated the questions, but it seems like every semester someone catches a question that's not in there. If it is, just email me. I'll fix it. I'll give you credit. It's no big deal. But the quiz is up. Also, discussion 2. Discussion 2 this week revolves around the 1619 project. If you've been watching the news, you've probably heard about it. I've got some articles, 2 articles up on the pros and cons of it. There's a lot of controversy with it. It's obviously for obvious reasons this summer. It's picked up a lot of steam. Actually, the committee that worked on it, I believe, won a Pulitzer. So kind of curious to see what your feedback on it is. I just saw on the news, I think California just adopted large portions of it for their statewide curriculum. So, but there's some historians that have some issues with some things on left and right type issues. So I just put it up there. And again, the discussion board is just something to kind of put your thoughts into. Blog 3, I've actually just recorded that is going to revolve around current events and some resources like CNN 10, Junior Scholastic, and the New York Times up front. Check that out. You may even notice I probably have the same pink shirt on. And Flipgrid number 3 is just your discussion. Discussions have been great. It's nice to actually see people that are on there. I meant to say, when you post, I thought I turned it off, but if you post and it says that it's private, I activate them, so don't worry about that too much. It shouldn't do that, but if it does, I'll fix that. So as long as you record it, post it up there, you should be good. That's actually going to revolve around some of the teaching strategies and things this week, and I'll talk about that at the end. But the Flipgrids have been great. So with all that being said, why don't we go ahead and talk about some teaching strategies, and I'll go from there. And again, if you need anything, feel free to contact. Let's see if I can get that down, and I'm just going to close that out. Sorry, I do talk to myself a lot. I always tell my wife it's the best conversation I have all day. And there's no one in this building right now, so I've been doing it a lot today. Community hall is empty. Alrighty, let's see, review slideshow. Let's do it. All right, teaching strategies, social studies methods. I'm just going to shoot through. If I babble, I'm sorry, I'll get back up on track. So let's just do it. All right, I tried to add a little color this week. And hopefully you can see that, but actually, I think I'm going to go the other way. I like it like that better. So I think I'll just click on each one. All right, teaching strategies, social studies methods. Let's do it. All right, we're just going to jump right into it. There's a lot of different strategies you can use. Your textbook actually gets into this week, and I've kind of mirrored it a little bit, but I wanted to talk and expand on a few points. Data gathering strategy is basically when you have your students in, you're trying to get them to gather information on whatever you're talking about. That can be acquiring information that is assumed to be valid, reliable, and necessary. This is where you're basically, you're memorizing your facts, you're defining, you're classifying. It's your lower level blooms, so to speak. So you're just trying to get that base level knowledge. A lot of times this is done with a lecture. Again, I think I've mentioned it in certain things. Lectures aren't a bad thing. I know some classes, they'll tell you that, don't lecture. I don't think I would ever tell you that, because it's just going to happen in social studies. It just does. It's just, you don't want to lecture all the time and for long periods of time. If you have 6th graders, you probably shouldn't lecture. There's no way you should probably be lecturing an entire class period. You need to break it up in some capacity. 12th graders can probably handle it a little more, but that's one way you can do it. There's other things. Some people use worksheets. Some people use, word finds, just somehow to get that base level defining. Some people just have students do definitions, get it. It could even be a reading of some type, but you're just getting that initial organization or data out to the students, that lower level blooms. If you're doing medieval society, you're getting some of the definitions like feudalism out, you're trying to get chivalry out, things like that. The one thing about it is just you need to have a clear set of goals. What are the terms that you think are the most important that students need to take away from your lesson? Again, that's where your standards come into play a little bit. Sorry, I'm looking at my face as I'm talking like you're there. But that's where your standards come into play a little bit. You got to make sure what your students need to know, especially because when you go to assess it, that's what you want to see that they know. And you need to treat things equally. You don't want to overload students. I think that is the number one thing that a lot of social studies teachers do. If you ask students why they hate social studies or why they hate history, it's because there's just too much information. This is something that I tell my students in this class every year, and since we're not face-to-face, I'm going to make sure I do it now. I love history. It's one of my favorite things ever. I was a history major, actually, and not an education major when I started. And then I got my master's when I went to WVU in education. I love it. You got to remember, when you have these students, one, they don't have the background knowledge that a lot of people do, that a lot of you will. And also, you want them to love it also. And just doing a big information dump in a lecture or something like that, a lot of times discourages students from actually liking history the way I think you would want them to like history. I'm not saying that this stuff isn't important. You just got to make sure that you're not. AP classes are really guilty of this, and I know that's a little different animal, but you know, when you're just throwing things out, it's tough. It's tough not to go down paths that you're just starting to like name drop things. You want to make sure that they understand what is important. This is where a lot of time guided notes help. If you have certain things that you want students to know, of course, that's a great accommodation also. Or when you just design your PowerPoints, you highlight certain things or you put in bold print the words that you really want the students to know when they're taking their notes. I think you're also going to find when students are taking notes, when you have PowerPoints, they're going to try to write down everything you have on the PowerPoint. You've really got to train them how to gather this knowledge. I'm assuming you're using PowerPoints, but if you go to PowerPoint Palooza, throw one up, you need to go through everything first and make sure you highlight what you want them to write down. If not, they'll write every single slide down, whether you post that up or not. So you just don't want to do an info dump. It's basically what I'm saying. You want the students to like the content. Obviously, you all like the content, and a lot of times that love is infectious to students. But you also got to watch. It's not with every student. Not every student's going to have history be their favorite subject, as silly as that sounds. So again, avoid the information dumps. Make your notes readable. Highlight notes. Do guided notes if you need to, especially for like 6th and 7th graders who are just kind of getting into the practice of writing notes. So that might be one. Here's some other, I'm sorry, I kind of jumped the gun a little bit, but some techniques for data gathering, a lecture. You know, you got to have a clear purpose. Got to have a little bit of drama with lecturing, sometimes a conversational approach. You've got to make sure you look over your notes and you have a background so you're not fumbling. Don't just go in and think, well, I know it, because then someone's going to ask the question. By the way, if someone asks the question, you don't know it, don't pretend that you know it. Just say, I'll find out the answer for you, something like that. But you got to have a little pizzazz with your lecture. And the only reason I say that is because if you're monotone and you just repeat it, it goes back to this. It's that over analysis, or that you don't want to make it too dull. I'm not saying that it needs to be a party. It's just you got to have a little bit of drama or a little bit of spunk. Move around, talk to students, ask questions. This is where we'll talk about it later. But if you have ed tech, I think this week actually in ed tech, I know some of you are in there. I think Nearpod helps with that a lot, where you can add questions and get feedback and do polling. I mean, we can do that in Zoom. So those are things that you need to do. Your textbook is a data gathering technique. And of course, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that textbooks are not used in social studies classes. They're an important tool. They're kind of phasing out though. And I know the first couple of years, sometimes when you first start teaching, especially, you're kind of dependent on that textbook. And sometimes there is good material in there and things that that's associated with that textbook. As far as resources that you'll get, they're sometimes really well done. You just don't want to have students read in class from the textbook too often, unless there's something specific that you want them to do. I'm not saying that I've never done it. There might be something that's in the textbook that I thought we needed to read together to make sure there was a clear understanding. But by and large, textbooks are kind of, I don't want to say they're phasing out, but of course they're going online, and you don't want to just be a textbook heavy class. But sometimes if you're trying to have students define things or have an understanding of a location or looking at a map, you might incorporate that textbook. So the textbook is a data gathering technique. I think I'm poo-pooing textbooks a little more than I probably should, but I just don't want you to be overly dependent on them. Of course, research projects, you might assign a topic and have students do a presentation as a group, or do a survey or something like that to kind of understand it and maybe teach the class on that. And, you might focus, things to key dates that kind of like relate topics and conversations and background information to students. Like if you're doing the American Revolution, you may just strictly look at 1776 and kind of branch out from there. So, and have people assign some sort of survey or group project based on that, maybe like George Washington, Declaration of Independence, something like that. But these are three pretty sound, I think, data gathering techniques. Your lecture, your textbook, and doing some sort of research project, and maybe having them share it. So, of course, that's the one that I think most social studies teachers use, at least in some capacity. Just don't make it all the time. All right. timeline. A lot of social studies teachers obviously like to use timelines to kind of give things a perspective. You can have students actually do a timeline, and it gives them something to kind of something to give them a little bit of context. This is something I always notice with students, and I'm looking around like I wish I had something to show, because I should have probably made a slide on this. This is something I want to use our chalkboard for. I'm going to say it, and I may even send something out on it. But one thing that I notice with students is when we teach, say you're talking about what's going on in England in 1600. I don't think students always are able to make the connection. Let's say 1607 more specifically, and hopefully in 1607, that's when Jamestown started up. I don't think students always are able to mesh that. Maybe you're talking about something, and I might date myself on here, but I believe like if something's going on with the Ming Dynasty over in China around the same time, that's happening at the same time. I think they compartmentalize things. Hopefully the Ming Dynasty was in charge in the 1600s. I might have to check that, but I think you get the point. The other thing that I think students find complicated sometimes is the idea of timelines, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but BC versus AD or BCE versus CE. I'm going to use BC AD only because that's what I grew up with. I don't think students always understand that BC is almost like a countdown to zero. So if Caesar, the death of Caesar, which is, in the 40s BC, I don't think they understand that that's 40 years from the year zero. And then from AD going forward, like I don't think they realize that we are in 2020 AD. Now that kind of brings me into another thing that you got to recognize if you're using timelines, and you might want to explain to students, is that AD, BCE, BCE, BC type thing. I was a little tongue-tied there. The BC, BCE, and the CE, AD thing. You want to make sure they understand that. If you're going to use, and a lot of textbooks now do use the BCE, CE thing, the common era, I would make sure that you explain it. I don't think, personally, I never had a preference. I kind of used both just depending on what it seemed like the students kind of used. But my default is BCAD mainly because that's what I learned actually here when I was a history student. But, it's just something I think you want to explain to students if you're using, especially if you're doing an ancient history type class. You also, and again, this is just some more resources that if you're interested in, and PowerPoint Palooza I'm not going to get into because it was on one of our lectures, but they also have a lot of things that you can get into and maybe use as data gathering. Actually, I think someone on the blog said that when they were doing their prep, they might even use PowerPoint Palooza to get a little bit of data gathering. I think that's fantastic, and that goes back to this. Make sure you do your prep. It's not, I'm not going to kid you, it can be a pain sometimes, but make sure you do look over the content that you're instructing. It sounds silly, but a lot of people don't. You don't want any surprises. So with all that being said, that's all data gathering. Timeline's a good way to do it. PowerPoint Palooza. Another instructional strategy that you might want to do is compare and contrast, and there's different ways to do this. But as I'm just going to read that. Based on developing, refining, testing, and redefining a set of categories or classifications, students are going to slot things. Allows for differences and similarities to be viewed, and it allows students to draw distinctions. We're getting a little higher up there in Bloom's among different phenomena, experiences, ideas, and endeavors. It's basically what that's saying is it allows students to compare and contrast. I'm pointing at the words. So let's look at some ways that you can do that. Some are pretty straightforward and some are, I think, a little different. All right, as again, it allows students to kind of build up on things, separate what belongs and what doesn't, and what might be the same. There are problems with this. Often categories that make up a comparison are not totally defined by the educator. And there's a little bit of point of view type things when you're doing compare and contrast. But by and large, I think even in that situation, it makes students take a position, and if they can defend it, I think that's a good thing. And sometimes with base level compare and contrast, and this might be a problem that you run into if you're using a textbook a lot, it's very basic where you're at the, there's in questions, I'm doing a Venn diagram, which we're going to look at in a minute. when you do that, it's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of it's like I'm pointing at my forehead. Or lower level blooms, it's probably right above it. Where some compare and contrast might be up here. It's my brain, and there's a compare and contrast. And hopefully, I'm going to assume everyone knows a Venn diagram, but you have one side and one side, and then the similarities are right there. It's something you can do on the board. You draw that up there and have students like individually put things up there. Something you can have them do. Now there's programs that you can do this, but yeah, compare and contrast is a great way to maybe kind of decipher through some information. Another one is T-charts. A little bit of a flow chart, especially in social studies, you can do it with events. Like this event led to this event, led to this event. You might have something like, the English Civil War led to Charles I being beheaded, to Oliver Cromwell coming in and taking over after the English Civil War. You might have students do that. It's a very popular way to organize things, and it is a little bit of a compare and contrast. It's a flow. So here's another one. You can tell this is a little for a younger audience, but you can also do your webs, and they can shoot out. You might have something to describe, but these are all nice little compare and contrast type activities. One I love to do, and actually your Flipgrid's going to kind of revolve around this a little bit. I liked using imagery and kind of have students do a little bit of compare and contrast. Sometimes when we were doing, maybe we were doing a unit on France and we were talking about something, or if we were French history, or if we were talking about medieval history, or even 19th century, if it just came up, I would have my students look at these two images. And just to give you a little context, this is Charlemagne and this is Napoleon. And some of the things that we would look for, if you look, I would have students study it, and then they would make a little list in their notebooks or on a sheet of paper or something. And after they looked for about, I'd give them 30 seconds or a minute. I would ask for some things that they notice and what do they think the differences are. And hopefully, if we're rolling and the class is on the ball and everything else, you might notice that this figure who looks religious is crowning Charlemagne. And on this one, the religious figure is just looking on, and Napoleon is crowning himself. And some of the things we would get into, and this would be something if we were looking at like church or papal power or something like that. In 800, when this is taking place, the Pope is crowning Charlemagne. So who has the power? Well, hopefully my students would say, well, it looks like the church does, because he's kind of a kingmaker. He's a Holy Roman, he's making him Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne. And this one, it looks like Napoleon has the power, because who's crowning Napoleon? Napoleon's crowning himself. So what I would hope, and maybe this is a little level higher blooms, I would hope, students could maybe can come to the conclusion that in 1,000 years, from 800 to 1800, the church doesn't have the power that they once had. And that's a little bit of a compare and contrast. So here, Pope, kingmaker. Here, Pope, not kingmaker. 800, 1800, a little bit of comparison. I like to do that a lot with artwork. There was another one that I used to do with Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, which is a very popular one to do, and how Saladin was actually portrayed in a very Western type appearance. I have tons of materials on the artwork and like history. I think it's kind of fun, and I think it actually is a pretty good hook for students. Nice bell ringer sometimes to have them try to look for things in these images. It's just something that they always seem to enjoy. So again, that's one way you could do a compare and contrast. All right, another technique that you might be able to do is a drama building. Again, I'm just going to read it just word for word here, but drama building examines the emotional impact of a story, person, or event or document, and provides a sense, somewhat, of involvement for the learner. Usually you might use some primary sources or secondary sources, speech, written work, and such. It's to provide you some sort of connection with the history that's taking place. These are kind of like simulations. Actually, if you looked at the resources that I put up this week with Junior Scholastic, they have plays that are in there. That's somewhat of a drama building. You're trying to get some empathy built up. There's one. I hope it works. It will work. Let me see if I can do this. I'm gonna hold on. Let me shrink this down. Maybe I want to show you all something. It's a resource. I can't help myself, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. Let's go. Interact. Lesson plans. There's a company called Interact. I'll put this up on the resources, even though I didn't talk about it in the thing. Interact simulations. They do tons of these things where you can do drama building type things in your class. While it's loading up, one that I had seen before was over at Boonesboro High School. Someone put Louis XIV on trial, and the class was, either pro-monarch, anti-monarch, and there was a jury. Actually, I think when I was on the observation, they asked me to be in the jury. So, I actually am not guilty based on what I saw. But, that was one thing that you can do. I'm not worried about any type of help right now, but thanks. As you can see, there's a lot of these. These interacts actually have lessons that are in there in simulations. I own 3, I think, and I was just kind of turning my head to see if I saw it back here. It might be in my office at my house. It might have been something I took home. I have one on Joan of Arc. The one I have on Joan of Arc was a trial on whether she was guilty or not guilty. I have another one, I believe, on creating a newspaper and kind of yellow journalism. They're all pretty good, but as you can see, let's see what they got in history. Outbreak, the zombie one seems to be very popular on geography right now. Oh, there you go. And these are all different things that you can do. Oh, there's the Joan of Arc. That's a history's mystery. But you can see these are all role playings, and they have primary sources. They have charts. The students have to construct things. Oh, one I had was on medieval society. The students had to create a village, and it takes you step by step. You probably can't buy the books anymore, and some school districts actually still have them, but you usually have to make handouts, and students do roles and have certain things that they have to look at, and at the end you come back. There was one that was really awesome. It was on a wax museum we used to do at my school. We would all have our students, whatever content we were doing, they would actually have to do a research on that, and at the conclusion of everything, we would have a wax museum, and they would just sit there and they would have an on or off button, and we would invite parents or other classes in, and they would hit it, and they'd have to do a research, some sort of presentation and background. They're really neat. But there's different ways to do these simulations, but I just thought I'd share it with you. But Interact is a pretty cool company that you might want to check out down the road. And, there's some good things. I want to make sure I have this. Yes, I do have the problems and the things. There are some great things about drama building. Usually it holds the students' attention pretty well, especially if the story is interesting. There's some gross aspects to it. The Black Death is something that students are always into if it's funny. Sometimes if it's done properly, it can definitely give a realistic point of view. There's other ways, and by the way, I said plays and simulations. There's other things you can do, role play, mock trials, you can do the dramas. You can also do TV-style programs where they interview historical figures. I've seen all of this stuff done. Be creative. Play to your strengths. If you're someone who's got maybe a strong theater background, I don't think this actually played to my strengths. I didn't do this too often in my classroom unless it was really structured or I kind of tweaked it a little bit. But some people that I taught with were fantastic at this. If you ever did national history, I worked with someone. One of the categories was, I think, performance. She had all of her students do something on a research on a performance, and they would, one of them was on Teddy Roosevelt, and he ended up, I think, finishing 8th in the nation. And he dressed like Teddy Roosevelt. He spoke like Teddy Roosevelt. You can do this in the class. We'll say one thing with this: be organized if you're doing it. That's the main thing. Usually most new teachers' biggest fear is always classroom management. It's still my biggest fear 20 years in. But if you're prepared, if you got structure, if you lay down what's expected, go over the rubrics and things like that, I think you're fine. And, the first time you go through it, there might be things that don't go the way you wanted to. You just tweak it. So don't be scared to do these. Just make sure you're very organized and structured when you do it. And be creative. Like I said, you can do TV. I've seen radio style interviews and things like that. Few little issues that you might want to watch also with that. If you assign a role, you got to make sure that the students know that they have to play the role the way it's supposed to be, especially if you're doing a play or a court case. They got to play their part right. And they don't want to, ad lib too much or anything like that. You want them to understand the actual content. And the strength of drama building is its weakness. It can reinforce opinions or emotions sometimes if it's not done properly. I think I mentioned in one of the earlier ones, I've seen some where if they're not organized they can get to be too much of a joke. And if you're dealing with a really serious topic, it can come off as a joke to the student, so to speak. So you don't want to do that. I know what it was. I think I mentioned something about the Holocaust. I don't know. That would be something I don't think I would try to do too much drama building around unless you really, really had some experience or had some awesome plan that you thought you could do, or you thought it was a group of students that could really roll with it, because you don't want to make something like that lighthearted. So that's just one of those things. So that's drama building. And again, there's some more ones. Oh, you know what? I actually should have mentioned this one. One I did see, I saw someone, this was in Jefferson County. This is when I was still teaching. We were over there for something, and she actually had like an like an Indiana Jones archaeologist type site, and they were like digging for mummies, and they actually had a decomposing mummy in the classroom. It was actually really cool. You could buy these kits. It wasn't a real person or anything like that, but pretty neat. And they had to set the stage. So, and there's some more, like I say, news, nightly news, boarding, stuff like that. Another thing for drama, I'm not going to play the YouTube videos right now. Sometimes you can even like use videos to kind of build up the drama. If there's a certain clip that you want people to like empathize with, Braveheart, you can tell this is old because I think this is like 10 or 15 years old. I think that was before the Stark had a little bit of problems. But, we would do the speech, and, we would talk about how that would get people all pumped up, and maybe why the Scotch were going to fight the British. Another thing that you could do, you can play songs, just to get things going. Someone I worked with one time did something from Forrest Gump, where there was a protest going on, and him and Jenny, I think, ran across the Washington Monument, and, just the emotion and how happy they were. She saw that he was alive. I haven't seen the movie in a while. You can do clips. Clips are always a good thing. Actually, sometimes clips are more powerful than watching whole films in social studies class. But again, drama building, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Another technique that you can do, frame of reference. Again, that's from multiple points of view in an event. I think you know that. Sometimes there's conflicting or overlapping viewpoints of an issue. A frame of references is, who do I trust? What's the truth? How do I judge the information provided? This is something I think students and people in general struggle with. Sometimes seeing things from other POVs or points of view. It's something I think personally we do. I mean, even as a teacher or social studies teacher, you need to sometimes put yourself in other people's shoes. That's always a good technique or a strategy maybe to try to do and see why people are doing what they're doing. You're probably going to ask students, why am I doing this? What was the point? And let's just jump down there. It could show maybe upbringing, politics, social status, culture, all these things. You know what? I've seen a lot of this lately. It just kind of popped in my head, but there's been a lot of the Spanish flu versus the COVID type images and why people are wearing masks. And a lot of it was because of the Spanish flu. And they're going back, why were they wearing the mask? Because of the point of reference. Maybe depression type stuff. Why were people going across to the West Coast? Because they were starting, trying to get students to think outside of their little, I'm going to say West Virginia because I'm in West Virginia, but their little Eastern Panhandle, homes and things like that. You got to kind of expand that mind a little bit. So that's always a good way to do it. There's, different things you can do. We'll talk about some techniques that you can do for a frame of reference. It allows students to view the influence of bias. It's gone now. The museum down in DC used to have some awesome stuff related to bias and how we view things and why we see things the way we do. Good lessons. One thing we'll talk about it here in a minute, but debating is a great way to do frame of reference. You can have students fact check, verify sources. That's something you can do with primary sources. That's a great lesson plan type thing, primary, secondary sourcing. And you want students to reach a conclusion. you don't want them to just say, well, I think it's this way. You want them to say why and expand upon it. But frame of reference, great strategy. You know, there are problems. Sometimes it's hard to get people to move from narrow viewpoints, and it can be a shock. There's arguments, lengthy discussions. There can be frustration. There can be cynicism. I'm not going to get into the choices right now. It's a link on there. You're welcome to look it up. I'm actually going to do that on one of the resources in a few weeks. So it does a lot of awesome lessons on frame of reference and points of view and why people are doing what they're doing. So it can get a little tricky, and especially, I was thinking if you're going to be out in the field any distance, if you have 370 or something, you're probably going to see it when you hit the classrooms on both sides related to the election. And sometimes people can't see the other side. I think this is a life skill, not just a social studies skill. So, and these things all are going to come into play. Some ways to do this, you can read written viewpoints, films, novels. I put a couple on here that I'm just kind of familiar with and I've used over the years. I never had my students read Johnny Tremain, but we would watch the Disney movie. And if you've ever seen it, it's very rah-rah, like it's a 1950s Disney movie. Like, it's very patriotic. It's a tall, tall tree is one of the songs. And it's very, USA. Nothing wrong with that. That's just what it is. There's no downsides to the revolution. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It's called My Brother Sam is Dead. I don't want to ruin the ending, but his brother Sam does die. But anyway, what that book does is it's about a family who lives in Connecticut. And they actually are Tories, loyalists, neutral, and then one son actually joins the rebellion. And it kind of gets into all the sides, like why some people would stay loyal to the British. They own a tavern, which actually gets taken over by both British and U.S. troops at various points in the story. It's really a good book. It's a good middle school book, I think. I think I've seen it read basically from 5 to 8. And it gave, different points of view that maybe, the revolution was a little messy. I used to show a film. It's a little dated, and it's got a couple scenes that are a little violent, but nothing I just had permission for them signed by the parents. But it was an old George Washington movie called The Crossing. It was on A&E, and A&E used to actually show like movies and all before, like Storage Wars. Before they did all that, they showed these movies, and it was really good. It had Jeff Daniels in it, and he was George Washington. And there's one part where they talk about where Washington is getting speaking very romantically about what they're doing. And one guy actually makes the point. He's like, well, aren't we doing this based on earning more money for who we are in our businesses and all? And it's not the poo-poo Washington. It's just another point of view. And it is a good point of view, or at least something good for the students to hear, to just kind of get them to think why they would agree or disagree with that statement. I liked Animal Farm. It's probably in my top 5 favorite books. I would have students, if your language arts teacher can be sometimes the best friend a social studies teacher can have, because you can put these integrated units together. And I was at a school where the students read Animal Farm, and we got into communism and the Russian Revolution. And we would talk about why these animals would revolt, and was it a good thing when it started? And the animals talk about how at the beginning it wasn't bad, and then it kind of becomes corrupt, and you can kind of look at it from their point of view. That periodic chart of dictators I mentioned, Napoleon the Pig is actually on it, if you look. All Quiet on the Western Front. I used to have to read it. I read that in 103 when Shepard used to have like Western Civ. I think they do it now more as a world history, but that's neither here nor there. It's actually written from the German perspective of World War I. It's just a different point of view, and that's something you need to think about. If you get into, the mystery thing, this is something that a lot of teachers like to do. That, you're trying to have students solve something. A lot of times, I think I didn't put it on here, and I probably should have worded it like this, but sometimes the escape box activities, I think, are a mystery strategy, and I've seen a lot more of those lately, where the students have to solve puzzles and such. Sometimes with those mystery things, as they're trying to solve it, I actually get students more interested because there's a level of competition with it. And they have to try to synthesize their information a little bit and make it click. And also with these mystery strategies, if you're interviewing people or trying to solve mysteries or reading different points of view, it can give you that multiple points of view that you're hopefully looking for in your social studies class. You know, sometimes these are difficult. A lot of people now, there's so many lesson plans online. Some people actually incorporate those. You got to have some engagement with it. Don't make it too simple. You want them to actually think a little bit and connect things to maintain their interest, and you don't want them done in like 5 minutes. But you also don't want it to be impossible. You want to try to trip them up. So it's good to try it. Another strategy is a controversial strategy. This is something I think, you get into issues of morality, justice, and order, right versus wrong. You want students to agree to disagree, lesser of, two evils type things. Sometimes there's not concrete answers. Again, I mentioned it earlier. I think this one's kind of timely because it connects so much to the election going on right now. And actually the resources that I was talking about today because I just recorded it before this, but the current events, sometimes, we all have different points of view, and sometimes it's about finding that middle ground and making compromise. And that's something, this one can kind of get into a little bit. It has a lot of problems and pitfalls, and I mentioned it with some of them, but because people sometimes have a tough time getting out of that frame of reference or their points of view. I talked about it with CNN when we did, when you look at the CNN 10. That one's a pretty straightforward news broadcast, but I've had parents, and if you look at any like Facebook groups on current events or anything like that, there's always like concerns about parents contacting because CNN is not, the cable news channel is not what people wanted. Some people want it to be, and they can't separate the two, so to speak. So one thing about this, though, it can bring passion. One of the best school debates I ever saw, it's an old documentary, but a lot of my students in 8th grade when we were doing debates were into that documentary Blackfish. It was about SeaWorld and all this. And we kind of had one about whether zoos were ethical. And that was something that was pretty good, actually. Sometimes with this approach, you can be flexible on points. I always, whenever we would do this, and we're going to talk about some of the techniques that you can do, when we're talking about this, I was always big on respect, not going over the line, or, things got shut down, so to speak. But I wanted my students to be able to talk a little bit. This also can be fun if everyone's like on the right, same page, not trying to be aggressive or hurt feelings or anything like that. I've kind of mentioned all this, but you don't want reason to be lost in the argument if you're doing anything that's controversial. Debate sometimes can be more about winning than learning. Thus, discussion is lost, loud, and limited. So again, you got to set those firm guidelines. The main goal with this is critical thinking at higher level blooms. So you got to make sure that the students are taking away some understanding. One thing that I always remembered, I had students when I did debates, I picked the sides. I wasn't worried about, I want to debate this. I'm like, you're drawing, whatever you get, you get. I remember we were talking about the death penalty, and that was always one of the better ones that we would do for some reason. And I remember one young lady said, well, when I came into this, I was very pro death penalty. I think you'll find for some reason it always seemed like 8th graders were very pro death penalty. I don't know why. But I had one young lady I remember came up and said, she goes, I was very pro death penalty, but after reading certain things about this, I've kind of changed my tune. So, I thought that was a good thing. And I always stuck in my mind that, you want them to make sure that they are, getting something out of this. Also, controversial type stuff sometimes can, you got to watch your comfort level. You don't want anyone to be super uncomfortable in your classroom. Obviously, you need to address things. Some things you may not feel should be maybe even debated. Maybe it's more of a structured lecture or something like that. But, obviously, topics related to racism, the Holocaust, slurs, things like that, that has no place in the debate, and you don't want anyone to name call or do anything like that. And also even the topics themselves, I never wanted anyone to be uncomfortable coming into my classroom. So you always got to be cognizant of that. This is a long time ago now, but I even remember when I was teaching, when 9/11 happened, I had a few Islamic students, and I had some students who would say things, and I would actually pull them out in the hall, and actually I talked to their parents, and it was very tricky because these were middle schoolers, and they weren't trying to hurt their friends' feelings. They just had opinions, I guess they had heard or that they thought. So what I'm trying to say is you just need to make sure you're not setting yourself up to hurt anyone's feelings. Anything that you do is controversial. You need to make sure you lay the groundwork. I know I've said that a million times, but I'm just trying to make sure you understand that. And make sure students are given a proper background on the issues. Spend time, make sure they understand what they're doing. That goes all the way back up to here. Make sure they're doing the data gathering. So let me jump back down. There's a lot of things that you can do. And again, some of these cross over. You can do the mock trials, the devil's advocate. You can do researchers, investigative reporters. Debates is the most popular one. Like I said it a million times, just make sure your debates are well structured. I have one. I'll try to post it and scan it. I have some debate setups that you can do. I'll make sure that they are posted up on Sakai this week, and you can kind of check them out if you want. But the way I like to do debates, like I say, we would have a group of topics. I would assign partners. There would be two to a team, depending on the club class size. Sometimes there might be three. But they would do the research. They would debate. No one could talk unless it was their turn. And they were really good about that. Like who goes up, makes the speeches, who does the rebuttals and things like that. It was when we kind of opened it up sometimes that it would get a little crazy. I would not let anyone talk unless they had, I don't have it in here, but here, I'll hold him up. That's Captain America. Unless students had some sort of device or talum or something that they had to hold, and just remind them that they can't talk unless they were holding it. I think it was a bobblehead cap. Mine were usually it was some sort of stuffed animal, or some people would have a speaking stick or something like that. Those all work, but you want to make sure it's under control, because I will warn you, debates can get away from you quick if you let them. Also, here's some. I probably need to update this list, but these were a few, I've done over the past. I'm lying. I've never actually handled these two. I don't know. One, I don't know what you would debate. I've seen, when I say Holocaust, I'm talking about definitions of Holocaust, like Armenia and the Turkish genocide, which I think has actually been designated one now, but there was some debate about that when I started teaching. Abortion, I put on here. I never did it. I just felt like it was a can of worms that I figured I might hear from some parents. But obviously that is a controversial topic. The rest, I think, are all things that I have done in the past. Some have, I think, gotten a little dated at this point. Capital punishment was a good one. Drinking age I've done with older students before, and usually, we kind of got it cleared with the parents before we did anything like that. I talked about the zoos. You can tell this is an older. Waterboarding was a big deal with Guantanamo Bay once upon a time. Walmart's small town debate was a great one. Actually, that's some of the best ones I've ever seen about whether Walmart was good for communities or not, because we would get into the employment that Walmart brings and the prices for areas that might not be having a lot of money. But then we would get into the small businesses that would just get steamrolled. It was a good one. Confederate flag was one we did. That was actually in a junior scholastic, and I know that's kind of ratcheted up again. That was one where I've had some good ones. You just need to set the boundaries. War and terror, again, that was an old Bush term. That was an older one. Prayer in school was a nice one. Cell phones, we've had some good ones on that. Students are always interested. School uniforms has been a good one. I've done that in public schools. I've taught in private schools too. It's a really hot button topic. Video games, various ones. And again, you got to come up with key statements with these so students can take sides. These are just generalities. Cuba, the one with Cuba was whether we should open up tourism and things like that. The Sudan, there was forms of genocide going on, and I think that kind of connects to that. I need to reword that. I've never actually, obviously, we've never debated the Holocaust. It's a horrible thing. Driver's license age has been a good one. That's one where, you know, it's some states it's not 16, and I think students are surprised by that. So that's always been one that we've liked. A Kyoto Treaty, whether the U.S. should be part of it or not. Animal testing. West Virginia studies, we've done mountaintop removal, and of course the dropping of the atomic bomb. I think I even mentioned that a little bit with the periodic chart of dictators. So those are all ones that we've debated. The only two that I can say just as a whole that I've never done on this, and these are different things, but I've never done abortion, like I say, just more from I didn't want to go down that road. Was never trying to sway people one way or the other. I just wanted to keep my class kind of on track. And that, like I say, the terminology there is bad. It's not the Holocaust itself. It's like things that were major events that could be maybe classified. And probably also another one that I know I did was Bosnia and what was going on there, because I had just started teaching, and that would have been in the late 90s, early 2000s, you know, some of the Bosnian type stuff. So anywho, but the rest of these I would say definitely, you know, I've done in some capacity, you know. And if you ever want, I'll put some more debate. I said the lesson plan. I'll try to put some other things on there. I've done brackets. I think I said when I did the periodic chart of loved and admired, we set up debates about, you know, who was the most loved and admired, and went through it. And students love them. I like debates. To do good ones, though, you got to definitely lay some groundwork. I'll talk about this as one of my resources. That was something that was on there. It's a Shoah Foundation. It's a Holocaust organization. Just to hype myself up a little bit, I'm actually at part of the HIT Foundation down at the National Holocaust Museum, and they do a lot of resources and such with teaching. And they teach teachers how to teach the Holocaust. And I'm going to send this out. Actually, I was going to do one on professional development. If you are interested in the Holocaust type topic, they do a teachers conference. It's actually pretty cool. It's cost a little bit, but it's not an abundant amount. It's called the Belfer Conference. They do an awesome job. They bring in speakers. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the story, Number of the Stars. It's I know it's more of an elementary one, but Lois Lowry came in. She wrote the book The Giver also, and she spoke a little bit and talked about aspects of Number of the Stars that people like and don't like. There's one called The Cage. I saw an author. They do all these workshops on how to teach the Holocaust and just social studies approaches in general and imagery. So we'll talk about that one later. The Shoah Foundation was actually established after Schindler's List. Steven Spielberg kind of gathered all these testimonials on speaking, their primary sources, basically their firsthand experience that people had during the horrible event. And now the USC, University of Southern California, has it. So that's a good one. But I put that on there because when we were live, it would be something that we would just kind of look at, and I didn't want to forget it, but I'll do it as one of our resources one week. So that's some strategies that you can look at. I know I was a little long-winded there, but feel free. I'll put the PowerPoint up separately too. I might actually jazz that one part up. I don't like how I might put some other debate topics up and clean that slide up a little bit and like that. So anyway, hope everything's going well. Again, if you have any questions, please make sure to contact me. Next week is going to be unit planning. We're going to get into that. That one, we're going to try something new with it. I like it. It's an inquiry based, and there's a template for it that we will go over, and that will be what a lot of our unit planning and things that you have to have will be in. If you have any questions related to that, though, we'll take care of it next week, and we can even set up appointments if need be. So with all that being said, I hope everything's going well. I know that was a long one. Hope everything for the class is cruising. You're all rocking it. Give you the thumbs up. Talk to you later. Bye. Okie dokie.